This is the Inside Data Center podcast. We talk to the people who power the data center sector to give you insider info on everything happening in DC today. Here's your host, Andy Davis.
Brought to you by Soben, Construction Consultancy Services.
Welcome everybody to the Inside Data Center podcast hosted by Andy Davis. We're here coming to you from Kickstart Europe in Amsterdam. Andy, what's your news of the day?
I had to come up with two now. Luckily, Virtus Data Centers have announced a 70 megawatt data center in Milan today. So Google CapEx earlier, 75 billion, now it's Virtus 70 megawatt. I don't know what I'm going to come up with for the next one.
Let's start browsing the internet for some other breaking news. We have two wonderful guests here today, Marc, Garner, Schneider Electric. Amy, can we start with you for an introduction?
Yeah, I'm Amy Young. I'm Director of Data Centers for Clean Energy Capital.
And I'm Marc Garner, Segment President for the Cloud and Service Provider segment in Schneider Electric.
So welcome everybody. Andy, shall we jump into the first question?
Yeah, I think I listened to the keynotes earlier and there's a lot of chat about power obviously being the key problem or challenge for the industry. So my first question was simply, can power keep up with demand? Because I think demand's insatiable, power is limited. So how can the industry manage that power challenge? So Marc, do you want to try and answer that really big question in 2 sentences?
I would love to, yes, on the spot. No, look, I think power demand is constrained in areas rather than power demand is constrained completely. Because there is power. There's power available within all European destinations. But where we want to build data centers, where we have the connectivity and where we have the infrastructure and experience in place, that's where our challenge lies. So Slough, London, Dublin, Paris, Amsterdam, Frankfurt, all these areas where we have big build out of infrastructure. I agree completely. We're very constrained there. That's where we've got to look at how we innovate and do things differently. How do we generate power in different ways, locally at site? Everyone's talked about SMRs today, renewable energy resources. How do we look at battery storage going forward? These are critical components in these dense data center areas. The bigger opportunity, though, is how do we move outside of those areas and start to access some of the power that is available in other geographies? And that's a much bigger opportunity. It's innovating in terms of how we work in the ecosystem, how we build the data center and operate the data center, and then how we work with the utilities to go and deploy data centers in the future.
Yeah, and Amy, what are you seeing from, I know you're close with a lot of these customers on the power, so what are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, echoing what you said, if we stand still and we follow just the geographics as they are as it stands at the moment, then the answer is no. Our clients are already saying to us we're waiting from grid, which is an archaic solution in terms of providing power as it is. Most of the dates are 2030 and beyond. And even that, how tangible that delivery date is, in all of our opinions, I think has a question mark to the viability of it. What we are seeing is definitely those that are spreading. So what we would have known at one point of an edge provider, because they're just outer city, is now becoming the more norm, because where we used to see data centers looking at, when they were looking at site acquisitions, network would be top of their agenda to make sure they're connected. Power has trumped that by an absolute mile now. Latency issues, because of how connected we are as a country and wider piece, isn't such a big thing now. For me, the great thing that we're seeing is the investment in alternatives and building out that ecosystem. So we are starting to look at grid paired with and combined with, be it any renewable source, so that could be right the way through to gas turbines, but looking at placing a data center where it can establish that community and the wider ESG piece as well. You know, data centers don't get the best of raps, like let's be honest. But if we can show benefit to a community that we're as they're putting it, invading, but we're moving into, and we can say, look, by us coming here, we're bringing an energy ecosystem that can in turn provide lower cost of renewable energy for the wider scale, not just the data centers, but the community as a whole. That would be, a utopia, but it is starting to come and become more of a norm. And hopefully in the UK, it will cotton on.
So we're seeing these availability zones widen because of that, because of net congestion, and we see people build elsewhere because of available power. Do you think we're proactive enough as an industry to take that social responsibility piece seriously?
Yes and no. So I think there is an intent and there is a want, but I do also think there isn't much doing. There isn't actually much physical activity. I've heard many speakers today talking about improving efficiencies in terms of infrastructure and everything, which has to be, it's paramount because we're looking to get the most out of the asset. There's a lot of people that talk a very good talk, but the investment needs to be driven. And at the moment, a lot of the time, it's the client end because they have their net zero by 2030 that they need to hit, and they're putting the pressure on all elements, not just the data center provider, but the infrastructure and everything in turn. So there can always be more done. Is my honest opinion.
I think there's a real opportunity here in the data center industry and everything that you're talking about here to really look to how we modernize infrastructure, not the data center infrastructure. I'm talking about the grid here and our utility infrastructure. We have all this opportunity to build renewable energy sources. This idea of us all being prosumers rather than just consumers of energy is really important. And the data center industry, I think it's already there. They're producing energy as well as consuming that energy. So the societal gain on the back of that, when we have excess energy available and bringing it back into community around the data centers that we're building, really important. But this is where I think, some of the AI development and the AI deployment, the application of it, becomes really important. You can't have a outdated grid and grid infrastructure that isn't automated and able to flip between a wind farm, a solar farm, and a traditional grid infrastructure. We need an artificial intelligence-led system to be able to drive efficiency in generation, consumption, and that then opens up the door to do much more with the energy we produce.
A lot of talk today about social value as well, which is I think one thing the industry needs to get better at is communicating that we can be the solution, not the challenge. I know we're always perceived as the problem, but actually we can be a real big part of the solution in regards to energy and power. Solution-wise, you mentioned SMRs earlier. We've got smart grids, we've got renewables. Where do we think it's going? Is it going to be what you've just said, where there's multiple options and you're kind of drawing the power from the best solution at that time? Or do you think we'll see more SMRs, smart grids? What do you think we'll see in the industry?
I don't actually think that any singular one of those presents the overall objective. It has to be, it's almost like when we talk in tech, like a hybrid model, you have to be able to, unfortunately, we don't live in a country that gives us 365 days of sun. And similarly, unbelievably, we don't have wind 365 days a year either. SMRs, for example, are 10 years out plus. We've got the problem now, here, today, so we need to lean into technologies that are available that can deliver quickly as a foothold in that sustainable market. And then we need to build out on that spectrum to add all of the complementary fields. I mean, in an ideal world, we would love to be able to say that we can 100% renewably produce a baseload for a data center. At the moment within the UK, that's near on impossible to do it without reliance on a grid that, as Pip from ARC pointed out earlier, we have the oldest grid infrastructure in the world.
We have the oldest every infrastructure in the world in the UK.
We're creaking, so that the innovation needs to come and it needs to start immediately, and then we need to build momentum on that as opposed to just waiting for SMRs to be accepted and sanctioned and actually be producing power.
Is this then an innovation piece that sits with the data center developers, or is this more a collaboration piece whereby governments, grid providers need to step up as well? You know, there are ways to do hydrogen self-generation on site. The infrastructure is not there, but you know, you can drive in trucks if you need to. So where do you see this going?
Collaboration is key, because no one individual company can take on such magnitude of the issue. So it's going to be the only way that it works, and it's something that as an industry we can either be exceptionally good at, or we can literally be like cloak and dagger, like smoke screens.
I think we've got to look at it outside of the data center context, because energy isn't a data center problem. It's a global issue. It's an issue country by country. You know, everyone's got different challenges and different levels of availability. One of the common factors when you look at energy loss, energy wastage, data centers represent 3, maybe 5% of the total consumption of energy globally. It's going up, we know that, but it's still only a portion of what's being used. In buildings, it's around about 40% of the energy consumption in buildings. Of the energy that goes into a building, around about 60% of that is wasted or lost, either in transmission or in the use. So is it an availability of energy problem, or is it how we're using that energy? And data centers become very visible, and rightly so, because we are high energy users, and we've got to be accountable for how we're using that energy within our industry. But more globally, when you look at it in a bigger scope, in the bigger picture, there's huge opportunity for efficiency in buildings, in manufacturing, in the transmission, in the grid. And this is where I think data centers become part of the cure rather than part of the problem. We generate more data that can be used to drive better models, better efficiency, more automation. I saw a great use case the other day around AI-led HVAC systems in education, and the carbon cost ratio for AI to manage it to the use of the HVAC was 1 to 60. So for every one cost in producing the artificial intelligence, you're getting 60 back in terms of return of the energy cost saved. That's a huge benefit.
It's quite a paradox, right? We have to worsen the net congestion problem first in order to deploy the AI models that will actually bring part of the solution.
Data centers using data for the solution. It comes up in all my podcast chats. Like, data center industry needs to use the data to create the solution. The irony is there, and I think from your point on what uses the power, we don't help ourselves as an industry when we're announcing 1 gigawatt data centers and 500 megawatt data centers. It's like the PR around it. I understand that the investors or the organisations want to announce the scale and the investment, but we're kind of shouting about how much power we're using rather than how much we're producing or passing back. And it's if you spin the way we communicate, suddenly the industry is not a power-hungry monster. Like you say, it's actually giving back the power to the grid.
It's also as well, if you speak to most of the larger, so the hyperscalers, the larger data centers as a whole, and indeed those that provide the infrastructure and everything that goes into it, they have so many amazing educational projects. They have community engagement projects. The money and the time and the expertise that is actually put into the areas and the locations that they actually work in, that never hits the headlines. That's never front and foremost, but and that's part of the bigger picture as well. It's not just what can we give back in terms of something tangible like power. It's we're in a data center event now with the level of expertise in this room, from M&E, from design, from manufacture. It's unfathomable, and that does get put back into where these data centers are being built. But you're right, it's the number that grabs the attention.
You've probably seen it as well. The industry's just not great at communicating. It's getting so much better than it was probably when we spoke 3 or 4 years ago. It's a different world now, but
Yeah.
it still just needs to improve the way it communicates, the way the messaging comes across. Because again, like you have Donald Trump standing up announcing 500 billion and people just can't understand the importance of it. They just see big numbers, and I think if we start to communicate the impact rather than the value or the power, we'll start to see a better response.
And someone said it on one of the panels earlier today that data centers are linked to the big power and everything else, but ultimately they're servicing a demand, and the demand comes from us. It comes from society, and that's all the data center is doing. If we want to curb our data consumption, then okay, but I don't see how we do that.
No.
We're all. I challenged someone a couple of weeks back to count how many times they interacted with a data center through the day. They gave up at 10 a.m. in the morning. So we're constantly interacting with the data center.
There's definitely a perception piece here whereby I feel that we are in an ecosystem that is very much focused on sustainability and innovation, and we see it every day firsthand. In the public eye, we're not. We're almost like old business and not embracing new generations and whatnot
We did a piece of work in Schneider, and it's available on the internet. It's called Bending the Energy Curve. But the idea, that the concept around this really is that between 2010 and 2020, the data curve went from 2 zettabytes to just under 65 zettabytes in terms of how much data we were generating and consuming as a society. The energy consumption in data centers over that period of time stayed flat. So we drove huge amounts of efficiency that didn't become visible because data centers were invisible during that decade, So there's a lot that's been done. We're far and above many of the industries out there in terms of what we've done and how we make efficient use of energy. The challenge has become over the last 4 or 5 years where the energy consumption and the data consumption have really started to mirror that path. So the bend in the energy curve is really how we start to bend away from the data, which is going to continue to grow, but really start to drive more efficient use of energy and start to separate that curve again in the future.
Definitely. And another question I was going to ask, because you're both close to customers, is like, how seriously are the customers taking power challenge now? Because again, it's always been there, like it's always been difficult, but is it now a key driver of their growth?
I've had 2 conversations with customers today, and the conversation has been more around whether they're real estate companies or whether they're power companies.
You're seeing power companies become real estate companies as well, aren't you?
Exactly, yeah. And this is, power is the driving force. You articulated it perfectly before, that it used to be latency, now power is the top of the agenda.
And that's why we're here from Clean Energy Cap, ultimately, because power is at the top of the agenda, and they are having to think outside the box, not because they want to, but because they have to now. And it's pushing it, like we say, top of the agenda for everyone.
You're seeing companies like Chevron, Repsol, and all these multi-billion-dollar or euro investments into the industry, like because they've got a lot of the power solutions. They can solve that problem, and they're now thinking we can do the real estate piece. We've got the power, so there's a bit of a battle now, isn't there, between the real estate and the power? So it'd be interesting to see where that goes.
We're in such a dynamic market now that we're constantly seeing new players coming into the industry. Everyone wants to have a conversation around what's happening within data centers and how they work within this industry.
It's not what is a data center anymore, is it? It's how do I invest in data centers?
Yes, exactly, yeah.
And it's what's your number? Like, how many megawatts have you got? Like, it's like a trump, isn't it? Each time for
a lot of the conversations I have with funds, it's like, do you think a billion's enough? It's that type of conversation now. Insatiable demand. So it's yeah.
In that piece, in the demand piece, do you, Amy, see if there's an opportunity to have grey power versus green power? One might be a little bit cheaper than the other. Is there still a selection criteria around sustainability there?
Oh, 100%. There are definitely some that take price point. It by far is a superior preference for them over actually a sustainable green product. And I think you get that in all industries. I don't think that's specific to the data center sector. There has definitely been a shift since, I hate to say the word COVID, but since we've come back from COVID and things have normalized somewhat, that now that the sustainability, the green piece is starting to press and become more important, because people are closing the gaps with having a more sustainable data center actually provides a cost-effective data center, and in turn is a stronger business case from a financial model than going at the input of like a brown energy source, for example. It looks cheap from the offset, but guaranteed that the impact that is going to have through your chain is going to have that negative effect. So it's looking at the entire picture of what you're putting in and what you're getting out, how you can improve those efficiencies the entire way through, not just one part. For example, you couldn't go in and solve a data center's problem and make them 100% green. None of us can do that one part. So, but it is factoring up there, not for everyone though, for most, but not for everyone.
As an industry, we have, for instance, the carbon neutral data center pact that is paving the way to setting standards on how we should operate and how we should embed sustainability in our business. There's also legislation piece, European taxonomy, Germany with their PUE requirements. From Schneider's side, you're very close to these topics because tech is being pushed in a certain direction. So how are you interacting with that? How are we solving the energy piece here?
We've got to come at it from all angles. It's not just about what we put into the data center, it's about how we work with grid utilities and everything else, and how we're working across the ecosystem. There is a really key point here, though, in terms of, I've been in the industry now for nearly 7 years. Feels like a lifetime. I can't even imagine me moving out of the industry, So, but in those 7 years, I remember in 2018, and we may have spoken way back then, Andy, but liquid cooling was the topic that everyone was talking about. Liquid cooling is now the topic that we're not just talking about, we're deploying and moving things forward. This is going to be a huge impact in terms of our PUE performance and how we drive efficiencies in our data centers. So in one way, yes, AI is going to drive more consumption and more demand for data centers, but it's going to make our data centers more efficient in terms of how we operate and how we use them. This bringing new technologies and the speed of adoption, 7 years to adopt liquid cooling because it was expensive. It is more expensive to deploy a liquid cooled solution. That's what we've got to get over, and that's where we have to work with the operators, with the industry as a whole to work out. Because overall, my view kind of at this point at the moment, the cost of deploying those data centers now going forward, I think they're going to be very similar. We get more efficiency in terms of the upstream cooling infrastructure. The switchgear changes ever so slightly. Maybe more density of what's going into a rack means we don't have to put as much copper or busbar in there. Maybe the footprint of a data center starts to shrink down, so you have less concrete poured, less steel going into it. The sustainability benefit on the back of it becomes huge when you factor all of that in. We're still very focused on the power side of things, though, so it's taking that broad view and how do we take a look at that. We as a business are spending a huge amount of time looking at how can we bring green steel into our products, how can we make our products more circular, so last longer in terms of its deployment, its operation, but then when it is end of life, bring it back and reuse it in another industry or another area. Really important to make sure we look end to end across sustainability rather than just power consumption, which is one part of it.
Exceptionally valid as well. Just as much we've spoken about the aged nature of our grid, we also have a lot of aging data centers in our country as well. There are some key ones that have been going in situ for 20, 30 plus years. And some of those are certainly not in the position to close down an entire data hall to refurb and upgrade. That has a massive impact on users and everything as well. So it's how we're going to bring those into line as well, because the older data centers, they won't be near a 1.2 PUE because they weren't built for it, because that wasn't how they were designed. So that's going to be another wave, I think, that's going to come, because they have a standing in the infrastructure terms.
And like the whole refit world, it's an industry on its own now. Like the actual refit, someone said one of the GCs, it's 30% of their data center turnover is refit, and you don't even talk about end of life or refit.
No.
There's all these data centers where the kit's being stripped out all the time. And like you say, how can technology enhance that? How can we increase the length of life, and therefore sustainably it's much more efficient? It's difficult, but we better move on to quickfire questions.
Yeah, let's do that.
We'll be here all day.
Amy, shall I start with you? 10 questions, please
Okay.
select one.
Okay.
There we go. Venture capital or private equity?
Private equity.
Finance or operations?
Operations.
Startups or established companies?
Startups.
Silicon Valley or Menlo Park?
Silicon Valley.
Innovation or stability?
Innovation.
Remote work or office work?
Office work.
Client meetings or financial reporting?
Oh, client meetings.
Leadership or management?
Leadership.
Future tech or current best practices?
Future tech.
And then last but not least, Kickstart Europe or DCD Virginia?
Kickstart Europe.
Yeah.
It's funny when you talk about the remote working. Well, Mark, your turn now.
Okay.
I've said this on everyone. Peter wrote the questions, so if you've got any problem with the questions, Peter.
Okay.
Edge computing or cloud computing?
Cloud.
Sustainability or innovation?
Innovation.
Right, it's on both of those, isn't it? Data centers or server rooms?
Data centers.
Leadership or management?
Leadership.
Sales or marketing?
Sales.
UK or mainland Europe? Be
I know,
careful
yeah.
with where we are.
I'm going to go mainland Europe.
Good choice. Good choice. There's a lot of people watching. Business administration or engineering?
It's business administration.
Tech conferences or client meetings?
Client meetings.
Work from home or office?
Office.
Kickstart Amsterdam or Cloud Can? You can say both if you want.
I'm going to go both, yeah.
I
I'm gonna
agree.
go both. I enjoy both of them.
Both for different reasons.
Yes.
Well, thank you to both of you. Amy Young, Marc Garner, thank you very much for attending. Andy, it was a great episode again.
Yeah, power. You could talk about power all day. That's the challenge, isn't it? It's like it's such a big challenge, but also so many solutions and innovation in the industry that we need to expose a bit better, I think. So, yeah, thanks to both of you for talking to us.
This was a half hour of power with Amy and Marc. This was the Inside Data Center podcast hosted by Andy Davis. See you at the next episode.
This episode was brought to you by Soben. We are a people business.